We're all in agreement that we are in the middle of a mental health crisis. You can watch my YouTube video from my TED Talk that I gave in February 2022 at Duke University, all about the mental health crisis and how to understand it. So the question becomes, though, we're in the middle of this mental health crisis. Is mental illness really more prevalent than it used to be? I'm Dr. Dana Torpy Newman. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I have been practicing for 12 or 13 years in many different parts of the country and in almost any clinical setting you can imagine.
I'm Dr. Eric Newman. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. I've been practicing since 2013, also all over the country because we kind of moved together.
Because we're married.
And yeah, I specialize in psychological testing, oftentimes children and adolescents, but sometimes adults. Yeah, and we're Newman Psych, and thanks for checking us out on YouTube.
So let's talk a little bit about the factors that probably make it likely that mental health problems are more prevalent than they used to be. One of the first things to understand is that there have been significant diagnostic improvements over the years. The first thing I want to talk about is our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. That is the gold standard for diagnosing mental health problems. It is currently in its 5th edition. It might be like a revised 5th
Text
edition.
revision, yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
I knew that. So many. And one of the things to know about the DSM is that it is a historical document. Here's what that means. That means that when we define mental illness at any given part or point in our history, it is actually based on what we view as our societal norms at the time. And so the DSM has been revised many times, 5+ over the years, because our definition of what is and is not normal behavior has shifted over the course of time. And so before, there were the way in which different diagnoses were defined were sort of misunderstood prototypes. So we'll talk about a couple of those because there are very clear examples of ways in which we thought various psychological disorders were defined by only one pretty narrow definition of one fragment of the population that actually meets criteria for that disorder.
Right. And over time, as we've kind of come to understand what that looks like, we've actually started to recognize as well that there are many people who have sort of more subtle presentations of a very kind of similar set of symptoms. So a couple of examples of that. So ADHD, for a long time, we viewed ADHD as the kid who was
probably a boy,
probably a boy, bouncing around, jumping out of his seat, couldn't keep his mouth shut, right? But now we recognize that ADHD is also characterized by people who just struggle to stay focused, get distracted, but they're just kind of daydreaming. They're kind of looking out the window when they should be looking at the whiteboard or something. Kids who have trouble staying organized and getting their work done because of organizational issues. But those kids are not bouncing around or jumping out of their seat, right? So this is sort of an evolution of our understanding of what that looks like over time. Another example of this is autism spectrum disorder. So, autism for the longest time was viewed as this, disorder where children couldn't talk. They were banging their head all over the place. They were flapping their hands, and it was just extremely obvious if someone had autism, right? There was over time a development in our understanding of that. And now we see kids who, instead of flapping their hands all over the place, or rocking their body, they're just kind of engaging, instead of these repetitive behaviors that are so obvious, just these repetitive vocalizations or something like that, right? Kids who, we thought it was just people who couldn't communicate effectively at all. Now we see kids who are still have the same kind of social impairments that kids with autism have always had, but their language abilities are good enough, typical enough, that they can actually communicate fairly effectively, even though the symptom dimension is the same, but the severity of the symptoms within that dimension is different. And so we recognize those things as evolutions of our previous understanding.
And that means that we're capturing more people. We also have better standardized assessment tools. So many years ago, it was kind of like well, I'm going to look at you and I guess like if your teacher says you're problematic or, your parent says that you are troublesome, I guess you have a problem. But we've really improved the range of standardized assessment tools. That includes the detail of the symptoms that we now view as being under different umbrellas.
And we also have assessment tools like neuropsychological assessment tools where we had some of these tests have been around for a very long time, but they were basically used to identify people with brain injuries. And over time, we've started to collect data on those same tools and modifying those tools and collecting large samples of data on typically developing children and typical adults. So now we have a better understanding of how people with various disorders function neuropsychologically across a number of domains. And not that there's any one neuropsychological profile that defines most of these disorders, but we have a much better understanding sort of what those things look like and how to collect very systematic, standardized data to understand that better.
And I think we should say across the lifespan, because there are, especially when it comes to things like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, those were things that used to be defined as disorders of childhood. Those things persist throughout adulthood. So a lot of times people they would sort of fall off of the intervention radar when they were 18. That's not true anymore. And related to this is the standards that by which we used to define mental wellness were probably based on primarily white men. And now we're starting to realize that symptoms differ by gender, by culture, by socioeconomic status. There are tons of variables that allow us to recognize just the breadth of what all of these different diagnoses can look like.
Right. So another sort of broad category of sort of reasons why mental health problems seem more prevalent has to do with, I think technological changes, we can call it broadly. If you think about the human brain, it's evolved over many thousands of years, right, to adapt to the environment. But until the Industrial Revolution, really, things haven't changed very much in human history. And so evolution happens very slowly over many generations. But come the Industrial Revolution and certainly the computer age, we've developed technology that moves much faster. And the human brain is not equipped to evolve at the same rate as the technological tools that we've developed. So that becomes difficult for people to keep up with.
And we have more demand than we used to because of all of these technological changes. So how often can you really sit in a quiet room and not be stimulated by your 10,000 electronics and all of the other things in your environment? What that means is that we are asking people to be more efficient, more organized, more flexible, and be more responsive in these very difficult environments. I often think about, because of course I do, I often think about what it was like during the Revolutionary War times. I know that sounds weird, but follow me here. I think about people who were just writing by candlelight every night and how they really had no stimulation other than the light of their candle and their quill. Think about how well some people could concentrate when the environment was so not stimulating. The house is quiet because it's dark, so everyone is asleep. There's nothing going on but you and your pen or your book and the candlelight. And that is the opposite of what our environment is now.
Right. The analogy I like to give, or the example I like to give people about this is think about email. We have email now, right? And that's a fairly recent development. And that's made things so much more convenient in so many ways. You can communicate so quickly with people, get answers right away, right? But that also means that when someone emails you, you're expected to answer right away, right? And so you actually, for all the convenience you get out of these things, it places so many more demands on your time. So you end up with 20 emails in your inbox by the end of the day, if you're lucky. And the expectation is sort of that you'll reply to all 20 of those, by tomorrow. So, so a lot of times people may have had minor challenges with organization, with flexibility, with efficiency, and being able to respond under pressure, all the things that Dana just talked about. Forever, those might have been sort of difficult, but they're manageable and sort of they go unnoticed as long as we don't have these increases in the demands that technology has placed on us. But now that we have all these demands, it's much more difficult for people with those same struggles to get by, and it's much more noticeable when they can't.
Here's another really interesting thing to think about. Right now, we have very streamlined expectations for what it takes to succeed. And that very narrow view of what it is to be a successful human is really hard for some brains. If you think about the way in which technology has shaped these expectations, it is so detrimental to people with different brains being encouraged to explore their interests and their talents and their passions in ways that are a good fit for them. So I often think about, this is not about technology, but this is just an example to understand it. Think about the defunding of the arts. The defunding of the arts leads to all of these people with creative brains having no outlet by which they can show how much they shine. They're instead, because the devaluing of the arts has resulted in you must be excellent at academics all the time. And that means reading and math and science. Not everyone is good at those things. And so we've basically set up an environment that is a poor fit for lots and lots of brains. Then we say that their brains are broken, when really, if the environment were a good fit for them, they'd look great.
Right, but those people do end up, because as Dana was saying earlier, our diagnostic manual is basically a historical social document that's based on our current definition of sort of social norms and what falls outside those norms. Those people do end up getting diagnosed with various mental health conditions.
Another factor that I definitely believe, and Eric believes, lead to more mental health problems than there used to be is increasing isolation. So one of my areas of expertise is couples therapy, relational therapy. So I talk about increasing isolation and lack of connection all the time. In fact, I'm pretty sure that in every video we have made, that is what I have talked about, because I do believe that that is a panacea for large numbers of problems that we have. And so let's talk a little bit about what this means. One of the things is that because of the technological expectations and the rapid fire of always being stimulated, we are so busy trying to meet demands that there's no space to foster connection between us. And a lack of social support is a risk factor for depression, for suicide, for problems in relationships, obviously, because if you don't have enough support, the relationships you have may not look that great. There are too few people providing support for the increased demands that each and every one of us faces. And so this issue in and of itself is so damaging to our mental wellness. We view the need for support as a weakness. I talk about this in another video about this revering of independence. That is not what we're equipped to be as humans, but that is what we tell people they should be, that they should be independent. And so when people need support and that's viewed as a weakness, they increasingly isolate. Well, when you increasingly isolate, what's going to happen? You're going to feel depressed. You're going to feel anxious. You may turn to substances. These are real risk factors for significant mental health problems. And they feel shame if they actually have to seek out support because it's that necessary. So this increased isolation and the valuing of independence over interdependence, which is having relationships where each person is providing support for the other and bringing out the best in each other. Without having access to that, we are doomed in terms of our mental wellness.
So the last major category that I think is on people's minds, so we're going to talk about it, even though it's not something we know a whole lot about, not us particularly, but as a field, is the impact of environmental toxins on rates of mental illness. There are a lot of things so since the Industrial Revolution, there has been, a lot of things going on that have probably impacted air quality, impacted water quality. We've introduced all these artificial foods and foods that have artificial preservatives and, all this kind of stuff. There are a couple of examples that people know of or that people ask about. Let's say lead poisoning. We know that lead poisoning can have cognitive effects, right? And so we've tried to eliminate lead. And so that's one example. Something that people often ask about are the effects of vaccines and whether there's a link between vaccines and mental illness. The big one that people often ask about is the link between vaccines and autism. At some point, there was a study to suggest that, which is why people believe that. That's since been kind of debunked. But the reality is, so we don't know anything about it. As far as we know, there's no link between vaccines and autism or any other mental illness. But the reality is we don't know a whole lot about the impact of these environmental toxins. And, maybe we'll find out more, and see what the connection is, if any, between various kinds of environmental toxins and mental illness.
So you can see that all of these factors lead us to conclude that, yes, mental illness is probably more prevalent than it used to be. And that became an even bigger issue during COVID and the aftermath of COVID. And so during COVID, there were increased demands on everyone to kind of be everything, right? So this was especially true for working parents who were then asked to also be teachers and who were, with their kids 24/7 with no breaks, no access to their social support, because a lot of times their social support, they didn't want to get them sick or get sick from their social support, so they were more isolated. And people reported a general worsening of their well-being, and it drove more people to seek services during that time.
Yeah, I think overall, COVID really highlighted, so that I think that's an important point, is that we do see increased rates of people, severity of symptoms and people seeking services after COVID. So it's important to note that, but it's also important to note these things were all happening before COVID. So,
yes,
this COVID just really highlighted and amplified these trends that we've already been talking about.
And some people for the first time had the ability to take the time to seek out services. Mm-hmm. There were many people who reported things like, oh, I have time to exercise or cook my own food or seek out telehealth. These were things that were not accessible because we're going all the time and kind of ignoring all of our symptoms because we just have to keep meeting expectations.
So this has been our take on, whether and why rates of mental illness seem to have increased. I hope you find this information useful. If you do, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button so we can get our message out to more people. We're really trying to get our messages about mental health related issues out to as many people as we can. We're tired of trying to do this on a client by client, patient by patient basis. So we really appreciate you checking us out, and thanks for tuning in. Keep an eye out for future videos.